Ladies and gentlemen, in the past 48 hours, whispers from inside palace circles have grown too loud to ignore. According to multiple sources familiar with the situation, King Charles has issued what aides are calling a final and irreversible ultimatum to Meghan Markle. Not a negotiation, not a warning, an ending. And what happened next has stunned even those who believed they had seen every chapter of this fractured family drama. Behind closed doors, Meghan is said to have made a desperate appeal, not through lawyers, not through public statements, but directly, emotionally, and urgently to the king himself. Palace insiders describe it as a moment of reckoning, a realization that the doors she once believed would always remain half open are now being shut for good. This is not about titles anymore. It is not about media narratives or carefully crafted interviews. Sources say the ultimatum centered on trust, control, and boundaries. The monarchy is no longer willing to bend. The message from the palace was blunt. The era of second chances is over. The privileges are finished. And the consequences, this time, are permanent. What makes this moment so explosive is not just Meghan's reaction, but the timing. With the monarchy under unprecedented scrutiny, and King Charles determined to stabilize the institution, any perceived threat is being dealt with swiftly and quietly. There would be no public argument, no back and forth, just a line drawn in stone. Those close to the situation say Meghan's plea was emotional, even panicked. But emotion, for the first time, may no longer carry weight. The palace is moving forward, and it appears ready to do so without looking back. So what exactly did King Charles demand? Why is this ultimatum being described as forever? And does Meghan truly understand what has just been lost? Before we go deeper into what sources reveal happened behind those closed doors, I want to hear from you. Do you believe this really is the end of Meghan's ties to the royal family? Or is there still one last card to play? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and let's continue. The lingering twilight of a late December afternoon slid through the towering Gothic windows of Buckingham Palace, casting long shadows across the thick Persian carpet of Room 5. This chamber, which had borne witness to countless ceremonial discussions over the centuries, was now the stage for an urgent closed-door meeting. No press, no protocol, no pageantry. Only King Charles and the three advisors he trusted most in the world. King Charles, the long-prepared heir who had spent a lifetime safeguarding the stability and legitimacy of the monarchy, sat at the head of the table, weary yet resolute. Nearly 3 years had passed since Harry and Meghan walked away from Britain, unleashing a storm of media chaos, the likes of which the Crown had never seen. Throughout it all, the king had endured with patience, clinging to the slender thread of family ties, a hope he had inherited from his late mother. But that patience was now teetering on the edge of collapse. At his side was Sir Julian Hawthorne, a veteran advisor and former private secretary to the Prince of Wales. Hawthorne was a reserved man whose sharp eyes glinted behind thin, metal-rimmed spectacles. Charles had dispatched him on the most delicate of missions to quietly monitor every move of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex in America. Publicly, the palace maintained a dignified silence. Privately, an intelligence network had been quietly weaving its web, tracking anything that might damage the monarchy's image. Hawthorne began his briefing. He offered no gossip, only meticulously gathered intelligence compiled over months. "Your Majesty," he said, "the final report is complete. The Duchess of Sussex is not merely building a personal brand. She is constructing an international network of influence and subtly positioning herself as the spiritual heir, even the alternative representative of the official image of the British crown." Charles inclined his head slightly. Since stepping back from royal duties, the couple had pursued a string of media projects, but what Hawthorne laid before him went far beyond independent career moves. The advisor opened a dossier and projected images onto the screen, photographs taken at private events, covert recordings of backstage meetings in California. In those documents, Meghan was shown using language that implied an unbreakable connection to the British royal legacy. She never claimed titles outright, yet in meetings with major investors, she deftly created the illusion that her initiatives were the modernized evolution of royal work. something they were left to infer that the United Kingdom itself had failed to achieve. One recording in particular sent a chill through the room. In a discussion with a global NGO, Meghan hinted that she was the true bridge to youth and developing nations, a role that those in London no longer seemed to understand. Inside Charles, initial shock swiftly gave way to profound disillusionment. From the moment Meghan entered the family, relentless tensions had wounded the institution, and Charles had always hoped time would heal the fractures. He had absorbed the interviews, the accusations, the controversial memoirs, but this was no longer criticism. This was a parallel operation, a systematic appropriation of the monarchy's image designed to supplant its legitimacy. This was symbolic warfare. She is attempting to polarize the monarchy itself, Your Majesty, Hawthorne concluded. On one side stands the traditional outdated British crown, on the other her reformed monarchy in America, global, progressive, forward-thinking. She uses her royal roots as a launchpad, while proclaiming herself the superior modern alternative. Charles closed his eyes. He remembered the video call he had placed just days earlier. One final attempt at discreet warning. On that screen, Meghan no longer wore the demeanor of a wounded daughter-in-law. She radiated the cool confidence of a rival. "What exactly did she say when I called?" Charles asked, his voice low and tired. "She admitted nothing, Your Majesty," Hawthorne replied. Instead, she spoke in veiled terms, ending with a rhetorical question. "A new era, sir, may require a new symbol." It was an unmistakable challenge. Those words cut through Charles's remaining forbearance like a cold blade. He had wanted peace, wanted to preserve family unity, even after departure. But this defiance made him see clearly this was no longer personal. It was a constitutional crisis of imagery. A monarchy cannot endure with two competing centers of symbolic power. The meeting ended swiftly. No immediate decision was announced, yet the consensus hung heavy in the air. When the advisers had gone, Charles rose and walked to the tall window. Outside, fine rain brushed against the glass, painting a mournful steel-gray London. He gazed down at the palace gardens where once there had been celebrations and warm family gatherings. He thought of the oaths of duty he had sworn to the nation, the responsibility placed upon him since birth. Protecting the monarchy was not merely preserving an institution, it was safeguarding a national symbol. If he allowed Meghan to continue building this parallel empire, even if only symbolic, he would set a dangerous precedent that could undermine the throne's very legitimacy. Charles exhaled a long, heavy breath. The warmth from the fireplace could not touch the chill that had settled in his heart. "I have been patient long enough," he whispered, almost to himself. "If she has truly chosen confrontation, then I must defend the crown at any cost, even if it means cutting ties forever." The city lights began to flicker on, but the room remained steeped in dim shadow, bracing for a decision that would close once and for all the most turbulent chapter in recent royal history. 72 hours after the sealed meeting at Buckingham Palace, Sir Julian Hawthorne was already back in the United States. This time, his mission was no longer vague intelligence gathering. He was hunting for irrefutable proof of an attempted usurpation of the crown's image. Across the Atlantic, Meghan Markle was accelerating her plans as though she could sense the ominous silence from London and mistook it for hesitation. She believed King Charles, with his conciliatory nature and dread of another public media war, would never dare take decisive action. That conviction had become the fuel for her audacity. Inside the sprawling Montecito mansion, Meghan convened her hand-picked team, or rather, the newly formed International Advisory Council. It was an assembly of power players, celebrated social activists, global communications strategists, billionaire tech donors. They had been recruited not just for prestige, but for their ability to provide a platform entirely independent of London's reach. Dressed in a meticulously chosen power suit, Meghan radiated unshakable authority, always placing herself at the very center of every decision. "We are going to become the modern monarchy the world actually wants," she declared to her inner circle. She never said replace outright. Yet every plan, Every internal document quietly screamed it. Hawthorne and his team zeroed in on legal filings and trademark registrations. They quickly uncovered a flurry of new applications, bearing names and symbols deliberately crafted to blur lines. The logo her designers were refining featured a stylized crown, subtle enough to dodge immediate lawsuits, yet unmistakable enough to trigger instant royal associations in the international public mind. On top of that, Meghan had scheduled a sweeping series of high-profile summits across 3 continents under the banner Global Legacy Initiative. The events were staged with grandeur, keynote addresses on social responsibility and cultural heritage, Meghan center stage. Major corporate sponsors, dazzled by the blend of established royal glamour and modern reformist thinking, rushed to attach their brands. They saw in her a fresh royal-adjacent icon, unencumbered by dusty protocol, and they smelled enormous commercial potential. Meghan was utterly consumed by the construction of her own empire. She worked without pause, intoxicated by the sensation of orchestrating everything herself. Warning calls from London only reinforced her conviction that the palace was afraid and trying to control her. She still believed blood ties would make Charles flinch. Meanwhile, Hawthorne dug deeper into leaks from Meghan's own legal team. He unearthed the draft of a document slated for unveiling at the inaugural summit, an international manifesto cloaked in lofty language about peace and humanitarianism. Its true intent was venomous. It subtly claimed that Meghan was assuming the succession of image and spirit of the monarchy in areas where the traditional British crown had supposedly become unreachable. This was no longer branding. This was the declaration of a parallel socio-political throne. That manifesto became the smoking gun King Charles had been waiting for. It crossed the line from independence into open defiance. Hawthorne compiled everything: trademark filings, summit schedules, sponsor lists, and most damning of all, the draft international manifesto. He bound them into a dossier, as airtight and merciless as an indictment. Late one night, in a nondescript leased flat in London, Charles received the package through a channel of absolute security. He sat alone beneath the glow of a single desk lamp, turning page after page. When he reached the stylized crown logo and the manifesto's veiled claims to royal succession, the sorrow and disappointment that had weighed on him for years evaporated, replaced by the icy resolve of a sovereign. Charles set the folder down on the oak table. The sharp sound cracked through the silence. He stared at the draft manifesto where Meghan had weaponized the very royal prestige she once shared to redraw the map of power. His gaze hardened into tempered steel. A long, lethal silence filled the room. After years of forbearance and fading hope, Charles finally understood that confrontation was inevitable, and concession was merely weakness. "It is time," he murmured, barely audible even to himself, to redraw the line. The king rose and walked to the window, ready to issue an irrevocable decree, one that would forever redefine the final bond between the crown and the daughter-in-law who had chosen the path of rivalry. The next morning, at Buckingham Palace, the air felt thick, as though a heavy fog had seeped through the walls. An emergency session of the Privy Council had been summoned. The rarest and most solemn gathering of senior advisors, cabinet officials, and the Crown's most formidable legal minds. They came together in full only when the institution itself faced an existential threat. King Charles sat at the center of the long table, the fatigue and hesitation of recent days gone. In their place stood unyielding resolve. Before him lay Hawthorne's dossier, irrefutable evidence that Meghan was deliberately exploiting titles and royal associations to erect a rival empire. Such conduct was deemed a grave violation of the monarchy's foundational principles. The legal advisors' faces grave presented 3 uncompromising measures, each rooted in constitutional clauses and historical precedent designed to sever Meghan from every remaining official connection. First, a clear and public injunction forbidding her from using any royal symbols, references, or implications in her commercial or charitable ventures. Second, the immediate revocation of all residual privileges, every last informal courtesy, security detail, or preferential treatment the palace had quietly maintained. This would sever every lingering legal and financial tether. Third, a formal declaration that the Crown would cease all protection or intervention in media storms and international legal disputes involving her. From that moment forward, she would face the world as an ordinary private citizen. Discussion was brief and merciless. No one in the room still believed negotiation or concession was possible. Everyone understood that further delay would only lend legitimacy to the shadow empire rising across the ocean. Charles listened to the final submissions, then raised a hand. The legal instruments were already prepared, dense pages of precise, unforgiving language. The king lifted the gold fountain pen, an act both ceremonial and seismic. When Charles signed, there was no pause, no flicker of doubt. The stroke of the nib did not merely authorize documents, it slammed shut a door forever. A long and tumultuous chapter ended with the quiet scratch of ink on parchment. Thousands of miles away, in the sun-drenched Montecito mansion, Meghan was at the peak of her confidence. She was reviewing the final script for the upcoming global summit. Certain her strategy was flawless, and that Charles would never dare retaliate. But even before the king's declaration was made public, the storm broke. Not from London, but from her own allies. A tidal wave of cancellation emails crashed into her team's inboxes almost simultaneously. International partners, multinational corporations, major charitable foundations, all shared the same terror, being seen as openly opposing the British Crown, an institution whose political and cultural reach dwarfed any individual brand. The big money sponsors had no intention of gambling their reputations on a symbolic war, especially once whispers of Meghan's self-coronation began circulating in elite circles. To them, the safety and permanence of the established monarchy far outweighed the risky allure of a renegade reformer. The withdrawals came lightning fast before Charles's statement even hit the wires. It was a blow delivered not by enemies, but by the very people she had counted as friends. In her study, Meghan took the panicked call from her brand manager. She demanded to see her personal inbox. The screen flooded with red-flagged subject lines. Cancellation of partnership, notice of withdrawal, project placed on indefinite hold. Everything she had built, the advisory council, the sponsorship deals, the grand vision seemed to disintegrate in real time. She stared at the monitor, disbelief rooting her to the chair. The hand that had once waved from palace balconies and later commanded media empires now trembled above the keyboard. "No," she whispered, voice breaking. "This can't be happening. They can't abandon me this fast." Her pride and certainty collapsed. She had wagered everything on Charles's hesitation and the world's adoration. Now she saw she had miscalculated both. That warning call from the king had not been weakness. It had been the final courtesy before the blade fell. She sat motionless, a sudden crushing isolation settling over her like a shroud, the first unmistakable tremor of an empire about to crumble. The following morning, King Charles's statement was broadcast worldwide. The language was measured, restrained, and scrupulously polite. Meghan Markle's name was never mentioned, let alone attacked. Yet, the message was unmistakable. Total, final severance. The announcement declared that the British royal family will reassert the principles governing the use of titles, symbols, and official associations, adding that all privileges not pertaining to working members will be reviewed and withdrawn. Though not a single hostile word was uttered, the press and public understood instantly. It was a surgical strike designed not to create spectacle, but to isolate one individual completely. The domino effect Meghan had dreaded began at once unfolded. Her International Advisory Council, already fractured by the flight of major sponsors, formally dissolved. No one wished to remain tethered to a figure the institution of her origin had just publicly disowned. Those who had hailed her as a trailblazer now saw only legal and reputational risk. At trademark offices across the United States and Europe, applications bearing her quasi-royal crests and names were frozen. Charles's decree gave authorities the perfect pretext to investigate misuse of national symbols and likelihood of confusion as to origin. The dream of a global brand built on royal prestige evaporated in hours. Inside the Montecito mansion, Meghan swung between shock and fury. She tried to salvage the last scraps of control, summoning the few remaining loyalists, now a frightened handful, for an emergency war council. She wanted a press conference, a defiant counterattack to cast herself as the victim of institutional vengeance and archaic power. But the phones stayed silent. The major networks and outlets that once fought for her exclusives now kept their distance. Covering her defense would be read as taking sides against the crown, a risk few global media conglomerates were willing to run. Former partners scrubbed her from their websites with almost indecent haste. Photos, videos, glowing testimonials, all vanished overnight. Every trace of past collaboration was erased to avoid contamination. The isolation was swift and merciless. The killing blow came from within. A trusted insider, wounded by Meghan's reckless acceleration despite London's warnings, quietly handed a cache of internal emails to a major British newspaper. The messages confirmed not only the full scope of the Global Legacy Initiative, but contained explicit references to Meghan claiming royal authority and positioning herself as the spiritual successor. The story detonated across the planet. Overnight, the narrative flipped. No longer a tragic exile, Meghan was now portrayed as the architect of an audacious attempted takeover. From wrong daughter-in-law became calculating usurper. The media storm swelled into a global wave of public outrage, not only from Britain, but from every corner that still revered the monarchy. Meghan, reading the headlines, found herself incapable of response. She sat motionless in the vast, darkened living room. The crystal chandeliers switched off. The space, designed to project warmth and power, felt cavernous and icy. Her smartphone, once an instrument of dominion, lay inert on the coffee table, finally silent. After hours of relentless notifications, she was drowning in a terrifying quiet. Every voice that had promised support, every partner who had applauded her vision, had vanished. She had banked on the might of American media and public adoration, but both had abandoned her. In the same breath, the security floodlights outside the gates dimmed one by one until only stillness remained. She stared into the shadows of the empty room, solitude seeping into her bones. "Why has everyone left me?" she whispered hoarsely into the void. This was the apex of collapse. No dramatic final battle, no blazing public showdown, only a rapid, silent, utterly hopeless unraveling. The empire, built in the dark, had crumbled beneath the weight of its own ambition and the cold, implacable will of the British throne. In the private study at Buckingham Palace, King Charles was reading the final reports from Hawthorne's team. They no longer spoke of aggression, but of the astonishing speed and thoroughness of the collapse. Meghan Markle, only days earlier a formidable international rival, had been reduced to total isolation. His advisors described it as a clean strategic victory. The image and legitimacy of the crown secured, boundaries redrawn forever. Yet the king felt none of the triumph the briefings implied. Charles was a sovereign, but first and foremost, he was a father. By issuing the decree, he had severed once and for all any remaining tie to a woman who had once been family, and in doing so, he had inflicted fresh pain on his own son. His gaze lingered on an old family photograph on the desk, one taken in the early days when Meghan was still part of them before the cracks had widened into chasms. He remembered the smiles, the hope. He remembered the genuine efforts he had made to welcome her, to reconcile tradition with the new energy she brought. He knew these measures had been necessary to safeguard the monarchy's foundation. Had he hesitated, not only the image, but the long-term stability of the institution would have been endangered by parallel claims that could have sown confusion worldwide. Yet understanding duty did nothing to dull the ache of personal loss. That was the eternal burden of the crown to choose between nation and family. Charles set the photograph aside and let out a long, weary breath. He knew the permanent estrangement of a family member was a terrible price, but Meghan's choice to press ahead with her empire, even after every warning, had left him no room to retreat. He had been patient. Her recklessness had forced him to draw the sword of royal authority. Hawthorne entered quietly with one last classified document from a government source. Its contents underscored the urgency of what had just been done. The file revealed that had Charles waited even a few more days, a powerful international body had been preparing to issue a statement endorsing Meghan's project and even recognizing it as an initiative led by a significant royal figure. That symbolic recognition would have created a perilous precedent, severely weakening Buckingham Palace's official narrative and proving almost impossible to undo. Charles closed the folder. Sorrow gave way to quiet vindication. He had acted at the precise moment required, averting a disaster of legitimacy. The irrevocable decision had ended the dangerous game Meghan had begun. The king rose and walked to the window, overlooking the silent gardens. He had preserved the British crown, yet he had lost a piece of his family, however troublesome that piece had become. He returned to the desk and looked once more at the old photograph. His eyes closed as though speaking to himself or to a memory already distant. "I never wanted to lose anyone," he whispered, voice low and rough. "But sometimes protecting the family means accepting that one must be lost." That was the harsh, merciless truth of royal responsibility. The decision had been made, the consequences accepted. This was the solitary sorrow of a king who had done his duty, even when the cost was a wound that would never fully heal. In the wake of King Charles's unequivocal statement, the British royal family moved swiftly into a phase of stabilization and deliberate image renewal. Far from a mere defensive reflex, the moment was seized as an opportunity to reaffirm core values and clarify the institution's role in the modern world. The palace unveiled a detailed plan titled Reshaping the Public Face of the Monarchy, placing uncompromising focus on working royals and long-established legacy projects. International communications experts unanimously described the move as both necessary and perfectly timed. They portrayed Charles not as a reactionary monarch, but as a leader who had taken the painful but essential step to safeguard the crown's integrity. The public, exhausted by years of being dragged through personal media warfare, breathed a collective sigh of relief at the sight of a clear, bright line finally drawn. Ambiguity was over. Meghan Markle's future place in any official narrative had been permanently erased. London resumed its rhythm with quiet efficiency. State events unfolded with the accustomed dignity and decorum, no longer overshadowed by rumors or drama from across the Atlantic. Freed to concentrate on its duties, the monarchy rapidly regained the respect and goodwill of a majority weary of private feuds. In his Buckingham Palace office, Sir Julian Hawthorne was packing away the last classified folders, formally closing the book on his covert operation. He felt the quiet satisfaction of a man who had removed a serious, latent threat to the institution. Yet, as he cleared his desk, an anonymous message arrived through an old encrypted channel he rarely used. The text was short, cold, almost devoid of personal menace. Yet, it planted a subtle seed of unease. Hawthorne froze. He stared at the screen, wondering whether this was empty bravado from an obsessive supporter or a genuine warning from someone inside Meghan's former circle. He knew her character too well. This defeat would not extinguish her ambition, only drive it underground, make it more cautious, more patient. Isolation and humiliation can be powerful fuel for an eventual return, a calculated revenge. He could not dismiss the possibility. That same afternoon at Balmoral Castle, far from London's clamour, King Charles walked slowly through the gardens. The air was crisp and silent. Pale December sunlight fell across the fading flower beds, still beautiful in their stubborn resilience. He strolled with hands clasped behind his back, savoring a rare moment of peace. The decision had been made and executed. Now he must live with it. He sought no victor's joy, only the calm acceptance of a sovereign who had done what duty demanded. Charles paused beside a late-blooming white rose bush, struggling against the season. He studied the petals, then gazed into the distance. He spoke softly, as if addressing the earth and the trees around him. A final affirmation of what he had done. The honor of the crown must be protected, even when the price is parting. It was the closing sentence of the conflict's final chapter. The monarchy had redrawn its boundaries. Meghan had been excised from the realm of symbols. Yet the anonymous message still hovered in the air, hinting that the story might not be finished, only suspended. The future could bring fresh challenges, but in that moment, at Balmoral, tranquility had returned to the throne. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this video. What we have just uncovered is not simply a personal drama, but a turning point that could redefine power, loyalty, and consequence inside the royal family. If these reports are true, then this ultimatum marks the moment when there was truly no way back. Now we want to hear from you. Do you believe Meghan's plea will change anything, or is this chapter finally closed forever? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you value in-depth investigations like this, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next exclusive update.